A man's reputation is a fragile thing, easily shattered by the whispers of jealous tongues in the gilded ballrooms of London. For Duke Alaric Thorne, his was already in pieces, a mosaic of tragedy and rumour that left him isolated and cold as the marble statues in his empty halls. They called him the Stone Duke, a man whose heart was buried with his family's fortune and his tragically lost love. But in that same ballroom, where his name was about to be dragged through the mud for all to see, a lone voice would rise in his defence, a woman with nothing to gain and everything to lose. The grand ballroom of Pembroke House was a sea of shimmering silk, glittering jewels, and calculated smiles. 1,000 candles burned in the crystal chandeliers above, their light dancing across the polished marble floor and casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to writhe with the secrets of the London elite. For Miss Beatrice Finch, standing near a potted palm in a gown of modest blue muslin, it felt less like a celebration and more like a battlefield where the weapons were whispered words and the casualties were reputations. She was here as a companion to the Dowager Viscountess Ashworth, a woman whose kindness was matched only by her timidity. It was a position that granted Beatrice access to such opulent events, but tethered her firmly to their periphery. She was an observer by trade and by nature, a silent witness to the intricate power plays of the ton. Her own family, the Finches of Somerset, were respectable, but possessed neither the title nor the fortune to make a splash in this formidable ocean. She was a sparrow in a peacock aviary, and she knew it. From her vantage point, she watched the crowd part like the Red Sea. A hush fell over the cacophony of laughter and string music, a sudden, palpable tension that could only mean one thing. Duke Alaric Thorne had arrived. He stood in the grand archway, a figure carved from shadow and severity. At 30 years of age, he possessed a harsh, arresting handsomeness that his perpetual scowl did little to diminish. His dark hair was impeccably styled, his black tailcoat tailored to perfection. But it was his eyes that held everyone captive. They were the colour of a winter storm, cold, grey, and utterly unreadable. They swept across the room with a look of such profound disdain that several debutantes visibly flinched. The whispers began immediately, a sibilant hiss that slithered through the room. "The Stone Duke," someone murmured nearby. "They say he hasn't smiled since the accident." "Accident?" another voice scoffed. "My dear, it was no accident. He drove his fiancée to her death with his coldness, and his father to an early grave with his recklessness." Beatrice felt a familiar pang of indignation. She had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. The Thorne family, once one of the most powerful in England, had collapsed under the weight of scandal and financial ruin 5 years prior. The old Duke had died of a heart attack, his vast fortune revealed to be a house of cards. Just weeks later, Alaric's beautiful fiancée, Lady Henrietta Croft, had died in a tragic carriage accident. The popular narrative, spun and embellished in drawing rooms across the country, was that Alaric Thorne's ambition and cruelty were the root cause of it all. He was painted as a villain, a heartless monster who had sacrificed his family and his love for what, exactly? The rumours were never clear on the motive, only on the condemnation. He moved through the ballroom, and the crowd shifted around him, leaving a wide, empty circle in his wake. No one dared approach him. No one met his gaze. He walked with a stiff, proud gait, a king ruling over a kingdom of ghosts, his only companions the ugly rumours that clung to him like a shroud. He eventually came to a stop near the French doors leading to the terrace, his back to the majority of the room, a solitary pillar of defiance. "Look at him," Lady Ashworth whispered to Beatrice, fanning herself nervously. "One would think he enjoys being a pariah." Beatrice studied him. She saw the iron control in his posture, the tight set of his jaw. She saw the isolation. But beneath the cold facade, she thought she glimpsed something else. Not malice, not cruelty. It was a profound, bone-deep weariness. It was the look of a man who had fought a long, losing war, and had finally decided to simply endure the occupation. Her attention was then drawn to a group of men holding court near the champagne fountain. At its centre was Lord Marcus Harrington, a man whose smile was as bright and polished as the buttons on his waistcoat. Harrington was everything Alaric Thorne was not: charming, affable, and universally popular. His family had, coincidentally, profited immensely from the Thorne estate's dissolution, acquiring several key properties and investments at a fraction of their worth. Harrington laughed, a booming sound that drew more people into his orbit. "The Duke graces us with his presence," he announced, his voice carrying across the room. "One must wonder what brings a gargoyle down from his perch. Perhaps he's searching for another fortune to ruin." A wave of cruel, tittering laughter followed. Beatrice's hands clenched at her sides. It was one thing to whisper in corners, another entirely to mock a man so publicly. She saw the Duke's shoulders stiffen almost imperceptibly. He did not turn. He simply stood there, absorbing the blow as if it were a physical thing. Beatrice had a keen eye for character, a skill honed by years of silent observation. She had watched Lord Harrington on many occasions. She saw the way his smile never quite reached his eyes, the subtle flash of contempt he showed for his inferiors, the predatory glint when he looked at a naive young debutante. She did not trust him, and she did not believe the simplistic, black-and-white tale that society had so eagerly consumed about the fall of the House of Thorne. Truth in her experience was rarely so convenient. Tonight, the air in the ballroom was not just thick with perfume and the heat of too many bodies. It was thick with a gathering storm, and she had the distinct and terrifying feeling that Duke Alaric Thorne was its intended target. As Lord Harrington refilled his glass, his eyes fixed on the Duke's rigid back, Beatrice saw a look of malicious intent that sent a shiver down her spine. The battle, it seemed, was only just beginning. The orchestra struck up a new waltz, and the floor filled with a swirl of colourful gowns. Beatrice guided the Viscountess to a pair of vacant chairs, settling her charge with a glass of lemonade before melting back into the relative anonymity of the alcoves. Her mind, however, refused to settle. It kept replaying the scene with Lord Harrington, the casual cruelty of his words, and the Duke's silent, stoic refusal to engage. She found herself drifting, an invisible current pulling her closer to the conversations buzzing around the room. She was adept at the art of being unobtrusive, of appearing to be studying a painting or adjusting her glove while actually listening intently. The subject, invariably, was the Duke. Did you see the look on his face? A woman with a towering feather in her hair said to her companion, utterly unbothered, "It's unnatural. A man with a conscience would show some shame." "He has no conscience, my dear," her friend replied, snapping her fan shut. "He's made of ice and ambition. My husband's solicitor, Mr. Davies, handled a small part of the Thorne estate's liquidation. He said the Duke fought for every last shilling, even as his father's creditors were closing in. He didn't care about the family name, only what he could salvage for himself." Beatrice filed the name away. "Mr. Davies." A solicitor. Solicitors dealt in facts, but those facts could be twisted by the person recounting them. Fighting for every shilling could be seen as greed, or it could be seen as a desperate attempt to hold on to the last vestiges of a legacy. It all depended on the narrator. She moved on, her path taking her near Harrington's circle again. He was now regaling a rapt audience with a more detailed story, his voice pitched for performance. And of course, poor Henrietta Croft was utterly besotted with him, he said, a look of faux sympathy on his handsome face. She refused to see the truth, even when her own brother, Thomas, warned her. Thomas Croft told me himself that Thorn was growing increasingly volatile in the weeks before the end. He was obsessed with a new shipping venture, one that required a massive infusion of capital he no longer had. The pressure was turning him into a tyrant. Beatrice's brow furrowed. She knew Thomas Croft, a man known more for his gambling debts and love of brandy than for his sound judgment. He and Harrington were thick as thieves. It was convenient that Thomas, who had also lost a significant inheritance that was tied up with the Thorn fortune, would be the primary source for this version of events. He demanded she break their engagement, Harrington continued, lowering his voice conspiratorially. He wanted to pursue the heiress to the Berkeley fortune instead. Henrietta was devastated, of course. She fled the house in tears, took the reins of her carriage herself in a distraught state. And the rest is history. He never even attended her funeral. The last detail landed like a stone in a silent pond. A collective gasp went through the ladies in the group. It was the detail that condemned him most of all. A man who would not mourn the woman he was to marry was surely a monster. Beatrice looked across the room at the Duke. He was still by the doors, staring out into the darkness of the garden. Was that the face of a man who had callously discarded his fiancée for financial gain? She tried to reconcile the vicious gossip with the man she saw. The image didn't fit. The pain she perceived in his posture felt too real, too profound to be the performance of a guilty man. It felt like the genuine article. Grief. Grief so deep it had been petrified, turning him to stone for the outside world. She thought back, trying to recall the society pages from that time. The reports of the accident had been tragic but simple. A spooked horse, a treacherous patch of road on a rainy night. There had been no mention of a broken engagement or a flight from the house in tears. Those were details that had bloomed later, in the fertile soil of gossip, likely planted and tended by men like Harrington. A sudden memory surfaced. Her own father, a country gentleman with a sharp mind for business, had once commented on the Thorn collapse. A tragedy of loyalty, he had called it. The old Duke was too trusting. He tied his fortune to men who were wolves in sheep's clothing. Alaric tried to warn him, they say, but it was too late. The boy was left to clean up a mess that wasn't of his making. Her father was a shrewd judge of character. He had no stake in London society's games, no reason to lie. His assessment stood in stark contrast to the venom being spewed here tonight. Beatrice's gaze fell upon Harrington once more. He was accepting a glass of whiskey from a footman, his eyes twinkling with triumph. He was not merely recounting gossip, he was conducting it, orchestrating a symphony of slander. And he was building to a crescendo. He wanted more than to just remind people of the scandal. He wanted to cement it as undeniable fact. He was turning public opinion into a weapon, and it was aimed directly at the Duke's heart. She felt a slow burn of anger. It was unjust. It was a public execution of a man's character without a trial, without a defense. She looked at Alaric Thorn again, the lone, dark figure against the glittering backdrop of the party. He had no allies here, no one to speak for him. Society had tried him, convicted him, and sentenced him to a lifetime of isolation. And in that moment, Beatrice Finch, the quiet companion, the invisible observer, felt the stirrings of something dangerous within her. It was a reckless, audacious impulse. It was the urge to do the unthinkable, the urge to speak the truth in a room built on lies. She knew the cost. To defy a man like Lord Harrington, to defend a man like Duke Thorne, was social suicide. For a woman in her precarious position, it was ruin. But as she watched Harrington raise his glass, a malevolent glint in his eye as he prepared for his final, public denunciation, she found that the cost of her silence might be even higher. The convivial hum of the ballroom began to wane as Lord Harrington stepped away from his circle of admirers, moving toward the center of the room. He tapped a manicured fingernail against his crystal glass, the clear, sharp chime cutting through the remaining chatter. One by one, conversations faltered and heads turned in his direction. The orchestra, sensing a shift in the atmosphere, trailed off mid-bar, leaving a heavy, expectant silence. Beatrice's heart began to hammer against her ribs. This was it. The crescendo she had sensed was coming. Harrington's smile was wide and benevolent, a mask of geniality that made him all the more dangerous. "My friends," he began, his voice resonant and carrying easily to every corner of the vast room. "If I may have your attention for just a moment. We are gathered here tonight in the spirit of fellowship and good cheer, celebrating the hospitality of our wonderful hosts, the Pembrokes." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the assembled guests, a masterful performer working his audience. Every eye was on him. Every ear was waiting. He was the sun around which the social planets of London revolved, and he knew it. Beatrice watched the Duke. Alaric Thorne had finally turned from the terrace doors, his face an impassive mask, his stormy eyes fixed on Harrington. He knew what was coming, too. He stood perfectly still, bracing for the impact. "In such company," Harrington continued, his voice taking on a more somber tone, "we are reminded of the importance of honor, of integrity, of a good name. These are the pillars upon which our society is built. A man is nothing without his honor." His eyes deliberately slid from the crowd and locked onto the Duke. It was a direct and unmistakable challenge. A collective, almost inaudible gasp rippled through the room. This was no longer subtext. It was a declaration of war. "We have all faced hardship," Harrington said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "We have all known loss. But it is how a man comports himself in the face of such trials that reveals his true character. Does he face his responsibilities with dignity? Does he honor the memories of those he has lost? Or does he, in his greed and pride, cast blame and abandon his duties, leaving a trail of ruin and heartbreak in his wake?" The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. He didn't need to say the Duke's name. Every person in that room knew exactly who he was talking about. Beatrice could see people shifting uncomfortably, ladies hiding their avid expressions behind their fans, men exchanging grim, knowing glances. They were witnesses to a man's public flaying. "So I would like to propose a toast," Harrington declared, raising his glass higher. The crystal caught the candlelight, throwing a fractured, glittering light across his face. "Not to wealth, which can be lost, not to titles which can be tarnished, but to character, to those among us who uphold the values of loyalty and truth, and to the solemn hope that those who have fallen short, those who hide their blackened hearts behind stone facades, will one day face the judgment they so richly deserve." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a profound, suffocating stillness. No one moved. No one spoke. To applaud the toast would be to openly side against a duke, a dangerous proposition, no matter how tarnished his name. To ignore it would be to slight Lord Harrington, an equally perilous social maneuver. They were all trapped, paralyzed by the audacity of the attack. Alaric Thorne stood alone, the target of every stare. His face was pale, but his expression was unyielding. He did not flinch. He did not speak. He simply endured, a lone bastion against a tidal wave of condemnation. Beatrice's gaze was fixed on him, and in that moment she saw a flicker in the stone. A brief, infinitesimal tightening around his eyes, a clenching of a muscle in his jaw. It was the barest crack in the armor, but it was there. And it was a crack that revealed not guilt, but a deep, immeasurable well of pain. Her blood ran cold, then hot. The injustice of it all was a physical thing, a fire in her veins. All her life, she had been quiet. She had been proper. She had followed the rules, but the rules were being used to perpetrate a monstrous lie. The silence in the room was not just silence, it was complicity. Lady Ashworth clutched Beatrice's arm, her knuckles white. "Dreadful," she whispered, her voice trembling, "simply dreadful. Let us find a quiet corner." But Beatrice didn't move. She couldn't. Her feet felt rooted to the floor. Her father's words echoed in her mind. A tragedy of loyalty, left to clean up a mess that wasn't of his making. The whispers of the gossips, Harrington's venomous words, Thomas Croft's convenient story, it all coalesced into a tapestry of calculated cruelty. And she knew, with a certainty that defied all logic and self-preservation, that she couldn't remain silent. She could not be one of the complicit. Slowly, deliberately, she took a step forward, disengaging her arm from Lady Ashworth's panicked grasp. Then another. She moved out from the shadows of the alcove and into the open space of the ballroom floor. Each step was a cannon shot in the stillness. 100 pairs of eyes swiveled from the Duke, from Harrington, and landed on her. On Miss Beatrice Finch, the dowager's unassuming companion in her simple blue dress. A nobody. She stopped in the no-man's land between the accuser and the accused, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Her mouth was dry. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her, but beneath it was a bedrock of conviction. She lifted her chin, took a deep breath, and prepared to set the gilded cage on fire. Beatrice's voice, when it came, was not loud, but it was clear and steady, cutting through the suffocating silence with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "Lord Harrington," she said, "your toast is eloquent, but I fear it is built upon a foundation of misinformation." The shock in the room was instantaneous and absolute. Jaws dropped. Fans froze mid-flutter. Lord Harrington himself looked as if he had been struck, his charming smile faltering for the first time. He stared at her, this insignificant woman who had dared to challenge him with utter disbelief. "I beg your pardon, Miss Finch," she supplied calmly, though her insides were churning. "Beatrice Finch, and I believe a toast to character should be based on truth, not on the convenient and self-serving gossip that has circulated in the wake of a family's tragedy." Murmurs erupted around the room. Who was this woman? What was she doing? Lady Ashworth looked as though she might faint. Harrington quickly recovered, his expression hardening into a look of condescending pity. "Miss Finch, you are clearly overwrought. A lady of your sensitive disposition should not concern herself with such weighty matters." He waved a dismissive hand. "You are mistaken." "Am I?" Beatrice met his gaze without flinching. "You speak of the Duke abandoning his duties. Yet I wonder how many people here know that when the Thorne estate collapsed, it was Duke Alaric who personally saw to it that every tradesman, every servant, every member of his staff was paid their due from his own dwindling personal funds. Many of his father's creditors were members of this very society, who clamoured for their share. But the Duke prioritized the common folk who would have been left destitute. A different kind of murmur rippled through the crowd. This was not a story they had heard. It didn't fit the narrative of a greedy, selfish man. Beatrice pressed her advantage, her confidence growing with every word. "You mentioned the solicitor, Mr. Davies. My own father had dealings with him and found him to be a man easily swayed by the highest bidder. Perhaps a more reliable source would be Mr. Albright, the Thorne family's long-time barrister, who retired to Bath shortly after the old Duke's death. He would attest that for a full year prior to the collapse, the young Mr. Thorne, as he was then, fought desperately to untangle his father from a series of ruinous investments recommended by a trusted friend." She let her eyes drift pointedly towards Harrington, whose face was now a mask of fury. She had no proof, only her father's remembered words and her own intuition, but she delivered the line as if it were established fact. "And as for the tragic death of Lady Henrietta," Beatrice's voice softened, but lost none of its strength. "You paint a picture of a callous, broken engagement. But is it not also true that Lady Henrietta's brother, Mr. Thomas Croft, was deeply in the Duke's debt? That he had squandered his sister's dowry on gaming tables and was pressuring the Duke for more funds? Is it not possible that any conflict between the engaged couple was born not of a lack of affection, but of the Duke's refusal to finance Mr. Croft's ruinous habits?" The silence returned, but this time it was different. It was thoughtful. She was planting seeds of doubt, offering an alternative narrative that was, in its own way, far more logical than the melodramatic tale of a villainous Duke. "And he did not attend her funeral?" Beatrice shook her head, a look of genuine sorrow on her face. "No, he did not. Because while London society was mourning publicly, he was at the Croft estate, not as a villain, but as a grieving fiancé. He was the one who arranged for her parents, who were infirm and overcome with grief, to be cared for. He was the one who settled her affairs and paid off the debts her brother had incurred in her name. He mourned her in private, with action and service, not with a public performance of grief for the benefit of gossips." She took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping the room, meeting the eyes of the stunned onlookers. "A man's character is not defined by the rumours that follow him, Lord Harrington. It is defined by his actions, especially those taken when no one is watching. You toast to honour and integrity. Perhaps you should first ensure your own words possess those qualities." She finished. The air crackled. She had not raised her voice, had not resorted to hysterics. She had dismantled Harrington's entire public assassination with calm, searing logic. She had given them not just a defence, but a reason to question everything they thought they knew. Lord Harrington was speechless, his face mottled with rage and humiliation. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He had been so thoroughly and publicly undone by a woman no one had ever heard of. And then Beatrice finally allowed herself to look at the Duke. Alaric Thorne had not moved, but the mask of stone was gone. Shattered, in its place was an expression of raw, unguarded astonishment. His stormy grey eyes were fixed on her, and for the first time she saw not coldness, but a flicker of a long extinguished light. He was looking at her as if she were the first thing he had truly seen in 5 years. In defending his name before them all, she had done more than silence a bully. She had reached across a crowded room and touched the heart of a man everyone believed was made of stone. The spell broke. The ballroom erupted into a cacophony of frantic, hushed conversations. The central drama was over, and the guests scattered like startled birds, eager to dissect what had just happened in the relative safety of their own small circles. Lord Harrington, his face a thunderous mask, slammed his empty glass onto a passing servant's tray, and stalked towards the exit without another word. His public humiliation complete, Beatrice stood alone in the center of the floor, the blood roaring in her ears. The adrenaline that had fueled her began to recede, leaving a terrifying void in its place. What had she done? She had just publicly accused a powerful lord of being a liar and a slanderer. She had defended the most notorious man in London. Lady Ashworth was staring at her with an expression of pure horror, already calculating the social fallout. Beatrice knew her position as a companion was forfeit. No one would employ a woman capable of such a scandalous public display. Her life was, for all intents and purposes, ruined. A tremor of fear, cold and sharp, ran through her. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly feeling small and exposed under the weight of 100 scrutinizing stares. She had to leave. She turned, intending to flee the ballroom and find a dark corner in which to contemplate the wreckage of her future. "Miss Finch." The voice was low and resonant, spoken directly behind her. It held a rough, gravelly quality, as if it were unused to being used. She froze. She knew without looking who it was. Slowly, she turned back around to face him. Duke Alaric Thorne stood before her, having crossed the expanse of the room. Up close, he was even more imposing. He was taller than she had imagined, and the severity of his features was more pronounced. The lines of bitterness and grief around his eyes and mouth seemed to have been carved there. But the eyes themselves, those stormy grey orbs, held none of the disdain she had expected. They were searching, intense, and filled with a profound, unnerving confusion. "You will accompany me," he said. It was not a request. It was a soft-spoken command, yet it lacked the harshness of an order. It was a statement of necessity. Before she could process it, he offered her his arm. It was a gesture of such formal, old-world courtesy that it seemed utterly at odds with the chaos she had just unleashed. To take a duke's arm was a significant act. For her, in this moment, it was tantamount to publicly declaring her allegiance. Her heart hammered. Refusing was impossible. Accepting was terrifying. Her hand trembled as she placed it on his black-coated sleeve. The fabric was fine wool, and beneath it, his arm was like granite. As her fingers made contact, a jolt, like static on a dry day, passed between them. He led her not towards the main exit, but through the French doors he had been standing by earlier, out onto the cool stone terrace. The night air was a relief after the stifling heat of the ballroom. The music and chatter faded to a muted hum, replaced by the gentle rustle of leaves in the Pembroke gardens and the distant clatter of carriages on the street. Moonlight bathed the terrace in a silvery glow, softening the hard edges of the world and of the man standing beside her. He released her arm and walked to the stone balustrade, gripping it with both hands, his knuckles white. He stared out into the darkness for a long moment, his back to her. Beatrice waited, her own fears momentarily eclipsed by a potent curiosity. Finally he spoke, his voice still rough. "Why?" It was the only word he uttered, but it was laden with 5 years of questions, of betrayal, of isolation. "Why you? Why now? Why risk everything for a man you do not know?" Beatrice chose her words carefully. "Because I do not believe truth should be a casualty of sport, Your Grace. What Lord Harrington was doing was not for justice or for honor. It was entertainment, at your expense. It was cruel, and it was based on lies." He turned his head slightly, his profile sharp against the moonlight. "You spoke with such certainty. You mentioned details. My father's barrister, the servants, Thomas Croft's debts. How could you possibly know these things?" His tone was not grateful. It was suspicious, laced with the ingrained distrust of a man who had been betrayed by everyone he had ever trusted. He thought she was part of some new, elaborate scheme. "I am an observer, Your Grace," she answered honestly. "I listen. My father once spoke of your efforts to warn your own father about his investments. The rest, I pieced together. The things Lord Harrington said, they were too neat, too perfectly villainous to be the whole truth. A man does not become a monster overnight. I simply offered the room a more plausible alternative." He finally faced her fully, and the intensity of his gaze was breathtaking. He searched her face, his eyes probing, looking for any hint of deceit or hidden motive. He found none, only a quiet sincerity and the lingering flush of her courageous stand. "A plausible alternative," he repeated, his voice softer now, tinged with a weary sort of wonder. "For 5 years, I have been surrounded by their version of the truth. I have listened to their whispers, endured their scorn. I chose to face it with silence, believing that to offer a defense would be to dignify the lie." He shook his head, a gesture of self-recrimination. "My silence, I see now, was mistaken for guilt. It gave them an empty canvas on which to paint their monster." He took a step closer. "No one has ever done what you just did. No one has ever dared. You sacrificed your reputation, your position, everything, for a man you know only by rumor." He paused, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Why?" The suspicion was gone, replaced by a raw, desperate need to understand. Beatrice met his gaze, her own fear finally melting away, replaced by a simple, unadorned empathy. "Because when I looked at you," she said softly, "I did not see a monster. I saw a man who was profoundly alone." The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. His composure, that iron-clad control he had maintained for half a decade, finally cracked. The stone crumbled, and for a fleeting, heartbreaking instant, Beatrice saw the man beneath, wounded, grieving, and utterly astonished to have been seen, truly seen, for the first time in an eternity. The Duke stared at her, the silence on the terrace stretching into a taut, fragile thing. The confession of his loneliness, spoken aloud by this stranger, had breached defenses he had long thought impenetrable. He seemed to be struggling for words, his throat working. Finally, he gestured towards a stone bench, partially hidden by a climbing rose bush. "Please, sit." Beatrice complied, her blue muslin dress pooling around her on the cool stone. He did not sit beside her, but stood, pacing the length of the terrace like a caged panther. The rigid, aloof Duke of the ballroom was gone, replaced by a restless, agitated man grappling with a flood of unfamiliar emotions. "You cannot know the risk you have taken," he said at last, his back to her. "Harrington will not forgive this. He will see you ruined. The Viscountess Ashworth will dismiss you by morning. Society will close its doors to you." "I am aware of the consequences, Your Grace," Beatrice replied, her voice steady. He stopped pacing and turned to face her, a bitter, self-deprecating smile twisting his lips. It was the first time she had seen even a shadow of a smile on his face, and it was a painful sight. "And you did it for a man who is profoundly alone." "A most unwise investment, Miss Finch." "Perhaps," she conceded, "but I have always found that my conscience offers poorer returns when I ignore it." His brief, harsh smile faded, replaced by that same look of searching intensity. "You mentioned my father's friend, the one who recommended the disastrous investments. You looked at Harrington as you said it." "It seemed a logical conclusion," Beatrice said carefully. "Lord Harrington's family benefited most from your family's fall. His animosity towards you is too personal, too vicious, to be mere social posturing. It feels like the frantic work of a guilty man ensuring his victim remains condemned. Alaric ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture of profound weariness. It was his father, Lord Gilbert Harrington. He and my father were friends since boyhood. My father trusted him implicitly. Gilbert filled his head with talk of new ventures in the Americas, of shipping lines and cotton speculation. He painted pictures of a fortune that would dwarf our own. He began to pace again, the story pouring out of him now, a torrent held back for 5 long years. I was young, but I understood finance. I looked into the companies. They were shells, most of them, designed to fail. I tried to warn my father. I brought him proof, letters from contacts in Boston, shipping manifests that didn't add up. But he wouldn't listen. He accused me of jealousy, of disrespecting his oldest friend. His voice grew tight with remembered pain. The day it all collapsed, Gilbert Harrington was the first to call in his loans, triggering a cascade that brought everything down. He used his knowledge of our finances to buy our most valuable assets for pennies on the pound at the creditors' auction. He destroyed my father and then feasted on the carcass. My father died weeks later, not of a weak heart, but of a broken one. He died of shame. Beatrice listened, her own heart aching with a sorrow she had not expected to feel. This was the truth, so much more complex and tragic than the one-dimensional caricature society had created. "And Henrietta?" she asked softly. Alaric stopped and looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant, unblinking stars. Harrington's story was a vile masterpiece, twisting every truth into a lie. Henrietta and we did argue. Not about a Berkeley heiress, but about her brother, Thomas. He was in debt to loan sharks and was forging my signature on markers. I discovered it and refused to pay them. I told Henrietta she had to cut him off. She was torn between us. She did leave in anger, but it was anger at her brother's betrayal, not at me. He finally looked at Beatrice, and his eyes were glistening with unshed tears. She was coming back. That night of the accident, she had sent me a note. She was coming back to me. The note was in her reticule at the crash site. I have it still. But Thomas Croft, in his grief and guilt, let Marcus Harrington convince him that I was to blame. It was easier than facing his own role in his sister's death. Harrington paid off his debts, and in return, Thomas gave him the story he wanted. The puzzle pieces clicked into place. It was a conspiracy of greed, guilt, and malicious ambition, all designed to ruin one family and elevate another. Alaric had been left to stand alone in the wreckage, his grief and his honor buried under an avalanche of lies. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Beatrice whispered. "Why didn't you fight back?" "With what?" he asked, his voice raw. My father was dead. The proof I had gathered was dismissed as the ramblings of a desperate, grieving son. The Harringtons, father and son, held all the power. They had society's ear. And I had nothing left to fight with. My heart was gone. My name was mud. Silence seemed the only dignified response. I swore my heart to stone and decided to simply endure. He took a step towards her, closing the small distance between them. The air was thick with his confession, with 5 years of unspoken pain. "Until tonight," he said, his voice dropping to an intimate murmur. "Until a woman in a simple blue dress, a woman with nothing to gain and everything to lose, stood up in a room full of my enemies and gave me back my voice." He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before his fingers gently brushed a stray curl from her cheek. His touch was tentative, like a man remembering a forgotten language. "Beatrice Finch," he said, her name a quiet revelation on his lips. "You did not offer a plausible alternative. You spoke the truth. The days that followed the Pembroke ball were exactly as Alaric had predicted. A terse, cold note arrived the next morning from Viscountess Ashworth, informing Beatrice that her services were no longer required and that her belongings would be sent to her family's modest London lodgings. Doors that had once been open to her, if only as an observer, were now firmly shut. When she walked in Hyde Park, former acquaintances suddenly found the distant horizon fascinating. She was a pariah. Yet strangely, she did not feel the sting of it, as she had expected. The fear and panic had been replaced by a quiet, settled resolve. She had done the right thing. That knowledge was a shield against the scornful glances and whispered insults. On the third day, a handsome carriage, lacquered in black with a silver ducal crest on the door, pulled up outside her building. The footman delivered a single, thick envelope. Inside was not a letter, but a deed. Duke Alaric Thorne had purchased the building she and her parents were renting, and had signed the title over to them. A small note, in a strong, masculine hand, was attached. A man must see to it that his allies are secure. A.T. It was a gesture of immense generosity, but more than that, it was a statement. He was protecting her. It sent a clear message to the ton. Miss Finch was under the Duke of Thorne's protection. A week later, another invitation arrived, an exclusive soirée at the home of Lady Danbury, the sharp-tongued, formidable matriarch of London society, whose opinion could make or break a reputation. Beatrice was shocked to see her name on the list. Curiosity and a sense of trepidation warring within her, she attended. She entered Lady Danbury's drawing room to an immediate, speculative silence. And there, standing by the fireplace, was Duke Alaric Thorne. He was not lurking in a corner, but was in quiet conversation with their hostess. When he saw Beatrice, he excused himself and crossed the room to her side. "Miss Finch," he said, his voice warm in a way she never would have thought possible. He took her hand and, to the astonishment of everyone watching, raised it to his lips. "I am glad you came." Lady Danbury glided over, her eyes twinkling with shrewd intelligence. "So this is the little sparrow with the eagle's voice," she said, looking Beatrice up and down. "Caused quite a stir, didn't you? I detest Harrington. Always have. Too much tooth in his smile. It took a woman of sense to finally call him out on his nonsense." With that pronouncement, the matter was settled. If Lady Danbury approved, then society, however reluctantly, would follow. Over the next few weeks, Alaric became a quiet but constant presence in Beatrice's life. There were no grand, public gestures of courtship. Instead, he would appear at her door for walks in the city's quieter squares. He brought her books he thought she would enjoy, and listened, truly listened, as she spoke of her life, her thoughts, her dreams. He told her of his own struggles, of the monumental task of rebuilding his family's finances. He revealed that her public defense had done more than just salvage his pride. It had prompted the retired barrister, Mr. Albright, to come forward from Bath. Armed with Beatrice's words and his own conscience, he provided Alaric with affidavits and letters from the old Duke that proved Gilbert Harrington's deliberate fraud. A legal battle was brewing, one Alaric was now confident he could win. Her act of defiance had not just been a social victory, it had been the key that unlocked the path to his legal vindication. One cool autumn evening, he took her to the London Observatory. They stood in the quiet darkness, looking through the massive telescope at the distant, glittering stars. "I spent years looking at the world like this," he said, his voice a low rumble beside her. as a collection of cold, distant objects moving in predictable, meaningless patterns. I felt I was one of them, a dead star, collapsed in on itself. He turned to face her, his features illuminated by the soft glow of a nearby gas lamp. The harsh lines on his face had softened. The perpetual storm in his eyes had calmed, revealing a deep, clear grey. "You changed that, Beatrice," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "You looked at me and saw not a ruin but a man. You defended my name when I had forgotten it was worth defending. You reminded me that a heart is not meant to be stone. It is meant to feel." He reached out, his hands gently cupping her face. "I swore my heart was buried and turned to stone. But I was wrong. It was merely waiting for you." He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of desperate passion, but of profound, breathtaking gratitude. It was a kiss that tasted of second chances, of silent promises, and of a love that had been born in the most unlikely of places, in a moment of reckless courage, in a voice that dared to speak truth in a silent room. The Stone Duke was no more. In his place stood Alaric Thorne, a man who had been pulled back from the brink, his heart no longer made of stone, but of flesh and blood, beating in time with the quiet, courageous woman who had dared to defend him before them all. 6 months later, the ballroom at Danbury House glittered with an even greater brilliance than the one at Pembroke House had. When Duke Alaric Thorne entered, there was no parting of the crowd, no hush of fear and scorn. Instead, smiles turned their way, and esteemed guests nodded in greeting. On his arm, radiating a quiet confidence that was entirely her own, was his fiancée, Miss Beatrice Finch. Her dress was of deep sapphire silk, a betrothal gift from the Duke, and on her hand a diamond glittered with the fire of a captured star. The whispers that followed them now were of a different sort entirely. They spoke of the spectacular downfall of the Harringtons, whose web of deceit and fraud had been publicly unravelled in a court of law, thanks to the Duke's relentless pursuit of justice. Lord Harrington and his father were disgraced, their ill-gotten gains seized, their names now the ones spoken with contempt. The truth, once given a voice by Beatrice, had proven to be an unstoppable force. Lady Danbury tapped Alaric's arm with her fan as they passed. "Well, Thorne," she said, her sharp eyes twinkling, "you look less like a thundercloud and more like a man these days. It seems you found a foundation worth building on." Her gaze shifted to Beatrice, a look of genuine admiration in her eyes. "Well done, my dear. You proved that one decent voice is louder than a chorus of fools." Later, Alaric led Beatrice to a quiet balcony overlooking the moonlit gardens, a deliberate echo of the night that had changed everything. He took her hands in his touch warm and sure. "Do you remember what you said to me on the terrace that night?" he asked, his voice a low, intimate murmur. "You said you saw a man who was profoundly alone." "I remember," she whispered. "I was," he admitted. "I was the last stone of a ruined castle, standing against the wind. But a single stone cannot be rebuilt. It needs a keystone, the one that holds all the others together, that gives the arch its strength." He reached into his waistcoat and pulled out a simple, elegant platinum band. "You are my keystone, Beatrice. You gave my life structure again. You gave my name its honor. You gave my heart a home." He slid the wedding band onto her finger, nestled against the diamond. It was a perfect fit. The Stone Duke was a ghost, a memory. In his place stood a man, whole and healed, looking at the woman who had not just defended his name, but had rebuilt his world. What a journey of courage, truth, and the incredible power of one person's voice to change a destiny. Beatrice Finch proved that true strength isn't found in titles or wealth, but in the conviction to stand for what is right, even when standing alone. She saw the man behind the monster, and, in defending him, found a love that thawed a frozen heart. If this story of defiance and unexpected love moved you, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share it with someone who loves a tale of justice and romance. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will capture your heart. What was your favorite moment? Let us know in the comments below. We love hearing from you and can't wait to bring you the next great adventure.